They said he was too skinny to survive, yet he became the most dangerous man in the history of the league. While the world bowed to the throne of Michael Jordan, one man was busy planning a psychological execution that would leave the sporting world in a state of clinical shock. We are talking about a specialist in the dark art of the mental breakdown, a player who didn't just want your championship, he wanted your soul. They called him a hero in Indiana and a nightmare in New York. But behind the legendary three-pointers and the razor-sharp tongue laid a series of secrets that the public was never supposed to see. From mysterious fires that leveled his mansion to medical anomalies that should have kept him from ever walking. The story of Reggie Miller is not a sports biography, it is a high-stakes investigation into the mind of a man who thrived on being the most hated person in the arena. Today we are pulling back the curtain on the scandals, the hidden files, and the moment he dared to strike the king. In the golden era of the 1990s, the National Basketball Association was a kingdom with only one ruler, and his name was Michael Jordan. He was the sun around which the entire sporting universe revolved, a figure so dominant that opponents were often defeated before the game even began, simply by the sheer weight of his presence. But in the heart of the Midwest, a slender, almost fragile-looking shooter from the Indiana Pacers was quietly preparing a revolution. Reggie Miller did not just want to compete, he wanted to dismantle the very sanity of the greatest player to ever live. He was a master of the verbal jab, a specialist in a specific type of psychological warfare that makes even the most disciplined professional athletes lose their absolute composure on national television. The tension between these two titans finally reached a catastrophic boiling point on the evening of February 12, 1993. This was not a typical basketball game. It was a televised collision of two massive egos that changed the way the league viewed the relationship between superstars and provocateurs. According to the official disciplinary reports filed by the league office that season, a physical altercation erupted on the court that left spectators and officials in a state of disbelief. It was a calculated attempt by Reggie Miller to break the focus of the man they called his airness. The aftermath was swift and expensive. As a result of the chaos, Reggie Miller was hit with a fine of $10,000, a massive sum in those days that was documented in every major sports publication from coast to coast. The newspapers of that era described the incident as a clash of egos, but for Reggie Miller, it was simply another day at the office. He knew that to beat the best, he had to become the man that everyone loved to hate. Investigative reporters from major outlets began to obsess over this new dynamic, questioning how a man with such a slender frame could possess so much audacity. But there was a hidden layer to this bravado, a secret energy that he had been cultivating since his earliest years. While the world saw a confident, loudmouth superstar, very few knew about the physical barriers and the medical death sentence he had to overcome just to stand on his own 2 feet. If you look at Reggie Miller today, or if you watch the footage of him sprinting across the floor to hit a game-winning shot, it is almost impossible to believe the physical reality of his starting point. He was not born with the gifts of a natural athlete. In fact, he was born with a severe hip deformity that many believed would prevent him from ever living a normal life, let alone an athletic one. His legs were so malformed at the origin of his life that he was forced to spend his early years locked away in heavy metal orthopedic braces. These were not the sleek modern medical devices we see today. They were cumbersome steel contraptions designed to force his bones into alignment. Medical records discussed in extensive interviews with the Los Angeles Times reveal a heartbreaking picture of a young boy who could only watch from the window while other children played outside. These documents indicate that Reggie Miller wore these braces until he was 5 years old, a period of his life that defined his psychological toughness. Imagine a child who spends every waking hour feeling the cold pressure of steel against his skin, knowing that his body is considered broken by the medical establishment. This was the foundation of his resilience. He did not learn to compete on a basketball court. He learned to compete against his own physical limitations. The reports from those early years describe a boy who was determined to shed those steel chains. When the day finally came for the braces to be removed, he did not just walk, he ran. But the struggle was far from over. Even as his legs grew stronger, he found himself living in a household where the standards of excellence were set so high that his own progress seemed almost invisible. He had conquered his body, but now he had to conquer the shadow of the person who was considered the real athlete of the family. For most aspiring basketball players, being the best in your neighborhood is a dream. For Reggie Miller, being the best in his own house was a statistical impossibility for a very long time. While he was struggling to find his rhythm, his sister, Cheryl Miller, was busy becoming a global phenomenon. She was not just a good player, she was arguably the greatest female athlete to ever touch a basketball. The psychological pressure of this dynamic cannot be overstated. Reggie Miller spent his entire teenage journey being referred to as Cheryl's little brother, a label that felt like a weight heavier than the steel braces he had once worn. The records of women's collegiate sports highlight a staggering achievement that still haunts the record books. On January 26, 1982, Cheryl Miller scored an unbelievable 105 points in a single high school game. Think about that number for a moment. While Reggie Miller was still trying to prove he belonged on the court, his sister was putting up professional-level numbers that made national headlines. In his own autobiography, titled "I Love Being the Enemy," he candidly reflects on the moments when he would come home after a good game, only to find that his sister had done something even more spectacular. Every time they played one-on-one in their backyard, the results were often the same. Cheryl would use her height and her ferocious competitive drive to dominate him. The public documentation of their sibling rivalry suggests that Reggie Miller's legendary shooting form was actually born out of necessity. He had to develop a high, arc-like shot just to get the ball over his sister's reaching hands. This was the environment that forged his lethal ego. He learned that the world does not give you respect. You have to take it. He was tired of being the second-best Miller, and he was ready to take that frustration out on anyone who stood in his way as he approached the professional ranks. Imagine the scene on June 22, 1987. The city of Indianapolis was buzzing with anticipation for the National Basketball Association draft. The fans had a hero in mind, a local boy named Steve Alford, who had just led Indiana University to a national championship. The state was ready to embrace their favorite son, but the management of the Indiana Pacers had a different, much darker plan. When the announcement came that the team had selected a skinny, unconventional shooter from California with the 11th overall pick, the reaction was not one of celebration. It was a roar of pure, unadulterated anger that echoed through the arena and into the living rooms of every basketball fan in the state. The archives of the Indianapolis Star from that very week described a city in a state of shock and betrayal. In the televised footage of the event, you can clearly hear the deafening boos from the crowd as Reggie Miller walked toward the stage. The public records of the team's front office noted that fans were calling the ticket office in tears, demanding to know why the organization had chosen this lanky outsider over a local legend. Reggie Miller was stepping into a hostile environment where his own supporters wanted him to fail before he even laced up his sneakers for the first time. This was a moment that would have broken a lesser man, but for someone who had spent his childhood in steel braces, the hatred of a few thousand fans was just another obstacle to be dismantled. Investigative reports into the team's internal dynamics at the time suggest that the coaching staff was initially skeptical as well. They saw a player who didn't fit the traditional mold of a powerhouse athlete. However, Reggie Miller didn't ask for their approval. He began to develop a chip on his shoulder that was larger than the city itself. He knew that the only way to turn those boos into cheers was to become so effective, so lethal, and so irritating to the rest of the league that Indiana would have no choice but to claim him as their own. But as he began his journey to prove the doubters wrong, he made a massive tactical error by aiming his verbal weapons at the one man you should never, ever provoke. Every legend has a moment where they learn the hard way that there are levels to greatness. For Reggie Miller, that lesson came during a preseason game in the early stages of his career. Most rookies would be content just to share the floor with Michael Jordan, but Reggie was not most rookies. By the middle of the game, he found himself having a decent night, scoring 10 points while Jordan had only managed 4. Emboldened by his success and fueled by the adrenaline of the moment, Reggie decided to do the unthinkable. He walked up to the king of the league and started talking as if they were equals, telling the superstar that there was a new kid in town who was taking over. The aftermath of this decision is well documented in sports history archives and has been recounted by teammates who were on the floor that night. According to the official statistics from that exhibition match, Michael Jordan went on a scoring tear in the second half that was nothing short of a professional execution. While Reggie Miller failed to score a single point for the remainder of the game, Jordan ended the night with 44 points, leaving the rookie breathless and humiliated. As the final whistle blew, Jordan leaned in and delivered a line that has since become part of basketball folklore, telling him to never speak to Black Jesus in that tone again. It was a crushing blow to Reggie's ego, but it also provided him with a blueprint for his entire career. In various retrospective interviews and sports documentaries, this encounter is cited as the moment Reggie Miller realized that words could be used as a catalyst for greatness or a recipe for disaster. He didn't shy away from the embarrassment. Instead, he studied it. He realized that if he could get under the skin of the greatest player to ever live, even for a moment, he had a power that very few possessed. He began to refine his approach, moving away from simple insults and toward a more sophisticated form of psychological warfare. He was no longer just a kid with a big mouth. He was becoming a scientist of human frustration, preparing to unleash his findings on the entire league. To understand the rise of Reggie Miller, you have to look beyond the three-point line and into the dark art of the psychological breakdown. He didn't just talk to talk, he performed a deep dive into the lives of his opponents. Investigative reports from Sports Illustrated during the height of his career detailed how he would spend time researching the personal vulnerabilities of the players he was guarding. If a player was going through a messy legal dispute or a difficult family situation, Reggie Miller would find a way to bring it up in the heat of the game, right when the pressure was at its highest. He transformed the basketball court into a courtroom where he was the prosecutor, the judge, and the executioner. This wasn't just about being mean, it was about survival. Because he lacked the raw physical power of many of his peers, his ego became his primary form of body armor. He used his voice to create a shield that made him seem untouchable, even when he was physically outmatched. Documentation from coaching staff meetings in that era reveals that opponents were often warned specifically about Reggie's mouth. They were told that the moment they responded to him, they had already lost the game. He was a master of the flop, a technique where he would exaggerate contact to draw fouls, often while simultaneously whispering something devastating into the ear of the defender who had just been penalized. According to the accounts of several former players in their memoirs, the mental exhaustion of playing against Reggie Miller was often worse than the physical toll. He never stopped moving, and he never stopped talking. It was a relentless assault on the senses designed to make the opponent question their own sanity. But while he was busy building this reputation as the league's most effective agitator, he was also heading toward a collision course with a city that thrived on conflict. The bright lights of New York were calling, and Reggie Miller was about to find the perfect stage for his particular brand of villainy, leading to a confrontation that would be televised to millions and change his life forever. If there is a place that truly defines the myth of the professional antagonist, it is Madison Square Garden in the heart of New York City. This arena is known as the Mecca of basketball, a place where legends are born and where the most demanding fans in the world gather to judge every move of a visiting athlete. But for Reggie Miller, this was not just another stop on the schedule, it was a personal battlefield. Investigative reports from major broadcasting networks at the time, including data from Nielsen Media Research, indicated that the television ratings for games between the Indiana Pacers and the New York Knicks were soaring to unprecedented levels. People were not just tuning in to see basketball, they were tuning in to watch a public execution of composure. The documents from arena security and local police reports during the early 1990s described a hostile environment that bordered on the chaotic. Reggie Miller didn't just play against the players on the court, he engaged with the celebrities sitting in the front row, specifically the world-famous director Spike Lee. This was not a friendly rivalry. According to several reports in sports tabloids and behind-the-scenes accounts from team staff, the verbal exchanges between the director and the player were intense, biting, and often crossed the line into personal territory. Spike Lee became the unofficial voice of New York's frustration, and Reggie Miller took great pleasure in silencing that voice. Public records of the league's attendance figures showed that every time the Pacers arrived in New York, the atmosphere reached a fever pitch. But what the fans didn't realize was that they were feeding the very monster they wanted to destroy. Reggie Miller used the booze and the insults as a form of high-octane fuel. He thrived in the toxic energy of the Garden. But it was in 1994 that this simmering hatred finally boiled over into a moment of pure, unscripted drama that would be replayed for decades to come, leaving the city of New York in a state of absolute disbelief. On the evening of June 1st, 1994, the eyes of the sporting world were fixed on the fifth game of the Eastern Conference Finals. This was the moment when the legend of the Knick Killer was officially etched into the history books. For 3 quarters, the New York Knicks seemed to have the upper hand, but as the final period began, Reggie Miller transformed into something supernatural. He scored 25 points in the fourth quarter alone, hitting shot after shot from distances that seemed impossible at the time. But it wasn't just the scoring that shocked the audience. It was the gesture that followed. As he buried another long-range basket, Reggie Miller turned directly toward Spike Lee and the thousands of New York fans, placing both hands around his neck in a clear, universal symbol for choking. He was telling the entire city that they were failing under pressure. According to the front-page headlines of the New York Post on the following morning, the headline simply read, "Thanks a lot, Spike," blaming the director for provoking the monster that had just decimated their team. The official game logs from that night record a performance that was so dominant it felt like a choreographed script from a television drama. The reaction from the league office was swift, as disciplinary files from that week mentioned the need to maintain sportsmanship, yet Reggie Miller remained unrepentant. He had achieved his goal. He had broken the spirit of a team and a city on national television. This was the dark side of fame that he navigated with such precision. He was the most hated man in New York, and he loved every second of it. However, as incredible as that performance was, it was only a prelude to a feat of mathematical impossibility that would occur just 1 year later, further cementing his status as a master of the improbable. If you were to ask a scientist about the probability of scoring 8 points in less than 10 seconds, they would tell you it is nearly 0. But on May 7, 1995, Reggie Miller decided to rewrite the laws of physics and probability. The Indiana Pacers were trailing by 6 points, with only 18.7 seconds left on the clock in a playoff game at Madison Square Garden. Most fans were already heading for the exits, convinced the game was over. But according to the official play-by-play transcripts archived by the National Basketball Association, the next 8.9 seconds would become the most efficient period of scoring in the history of the sport. Reggie Miller hit a three-pointer, then immediately stole the inbound pass from the stunned Knicks players, stepped back, and hit another three-pointer to tie the game in a matter of 5 seconds. After the Knicks missed their own shots under the pressure, Reggie was fouled and calmly sank 2 free throws to give the Pacers the lead. The statistics from the final box score confirmed that he had produced 8 points in just 8.9 seconds. The silence that fell over the arena was so profound that it was described by reporters on the scene as an eerie, ghost-like atmosphere. The city of New York was in a state of clinical shock. In the post-game interviews recorded by national media outlets, Reggie Miller appeared almost bored by his own brilliance, further irritating his detractors. He had taken the heart out of his rivals once again, but while his professional life was reaching heights of almost mythological proportions, a dark cloud was beginning to form over his private world. Just as he was becoming an untouchable icon on the hardwood, the safety of his personal life was about to be shattered by a mysterious and devastating event that would leave his $2,900,000 mansion in ruins and spark a series of unanswered questions. In the life of a man as provocative as Reggie Miller, enemies are not just made on the hardwood, they are cultivated in every city he visits. But on the morning of May 15, 1997, the conflict followed him all the way to his private sanctuary in Indianapolis. While the world was focusing on the next championship run, the 5,000-square-foot dream home of the Indiana Pacers star was being consumed by a massive, unexplained fire. This was not a minor accident in the kitchen. According to the official investigative reports from the local fire department and subsequent insurance filings, the damage was estimated at a staggering $2,900,000. Every trophy, every memory, and every piece of evidence from his rise to fame was reduced to a pile of gray ash in a matter of hours. The investigation into the origin of the blaze sparked a wave of national speculation that the media of the time could barely contain. Rumors swirled through the sports tabloids, with some suggesting that a disgruntled fan from a rival city had finally taken the Nick Killer nickname too literally. Public records from the authorities indicated that the cause of the fire was labeled as undetermined, a phrase that, in the world of high-stakes sports, usually translates to, "We have more questions than answers." Investigative journalists from major outlets noted that Reggie Miller remained strangely silent about the details of the tragedy, refusing to engage in the public's thirst for a culprit. Was this an act of targeted malice, or was it a dark omen that his reign of psychological terror was starting to spark a real-world backlash? Despite the devastating loss of his property, Reggie Miller didn't allow the tragedy to soften his edges. In fact, some observers believe the fire only hardened his resolve. The reports from the following season described a man who seemed to have nothing left to lose. He had lost his home, but he still had his sights set on the one thing that had eluded him, the total defeat of the man who occupied the throne in Chicago. But as he prepared for the ultimate showdown, he was stepping into a series that would push both him and Michael Jordan to the absolute brink of their physical and mental capacities. By the season of 1997 to 1998, the league felt like it was approaching an era-defining climax. Michael Jordan and his Chicago Bulls were on their last dance, but Reggie Miller was determined to make sure that dance ended in a stumble. This was the series that the world had been waiting for, the ultimate hero versus the ultimate antagonist. According to the official NBA playoff logs from that spring, the Eastern Conference Finals stretched to a grueling 7-game series, a feat that almost no other team had managed against the Bulls during their championship years. It was a war of attrition where every possession felt like a high-stakes investigation into the limits of human endurance. The statistics archived by professional sports analysts show that Reggie Miller was the only player in that era who could consistently make Michael Jordan look human. Reporters covering the series noted that the atmosphere in the locker rooms was thick with a tension that hadn't been seen since the early 1990s. Jordan himself would later admit in various retrospective interviews and documentary footage that Reggie Miller provided a level of physical and mental exhaustion that few others could match. This wasn't just about shooting basketballs. It was about two massive egos trying to occupy the same space in history. The public documents from the league during that month highlight a record-breaking level of viewership as millions tuned in to see if the skinny shooter from Indiana could finally do the impossible. The games were decided by the narrowest of margins, with the official scoreboards often separated by just a few points in the final minutes. Every foul, every word whispered on the court, and every glance toward the bench was scrutinized by the media as if it were a piece of evidence in a criminal trial. But it was in the fourth game of this legendary series that Reggie Miller would commit an act so controversial that it still sparks heated debates in sports bars across America to this day. It was a moment that redefined the concept of winning at all costs, and it left the greatest player in the world screaming for a justice that never came. The date was May 24, 1998, and the tension inside Market Square Arena was enough to make even the most seasoned veteran tremble. With only a few seconds remaining on the clock, the Indiana Pacers were trailing, and their season was hanging by a thread. The ball was inbounded to Reggie Miller, who appeared to shove Michael Jordan with significant force to create the space he needed for a final shot. As the ball left his fingertips and sailed through the net, the arena exploded, but the replay told a much more complicated story. According to the post-game referee reports and the analysis provided by the league's officiating office, no foul was called on the play, allowing the basket to stand and giving the Pacers a historic victory. The controversy that erupted the next morning was unlike anything the sports world had seen. Headlines across the country questioned whether the Knick killer had become a king robber. Investigative pieces in sports magazines analyzed the video frame by frame, with many concluding that the contact was more than enough to warrant a whistle. Yet, Reggie Miller stood by his actions, appearing in the press with a smirk that only added fuel to the fire. He had looked the greatest player in history in the eye, physically moved him out of the way, and taken what he wanted. Public opinion was split. Some saw it as a brilliant veteran move, while others viewed it as the ultimate act of disrespect toward the integrity of the game. However, as Reggie Miller was reaching this pinnacle of professional defiance, his personal life was beginning to show cracks that no amount of fame could fill. While he was winning battles on the hardwood against the world's greatest athletes, he was quietly losing a much more expensive war in the courtrooms of Indiana. The documents from his private affairs were about to become public knowledge, revealing a financial and emotional toll that threatened to dismantle his legacy faster than any rival player ever could. The man who seemed to have an answer for everything was about to face a situation where his mouth couldn't save him from a multi-million-dollar disaster. While the world was busy counting the three-pointers Reggie Miller was sinking on national television, the accountants and lawyers in Indiana were busy counting the millions that were slipping through his fingers. The year 2001 marked the beginning of a financial and personal nightmare that would peel back the curtain on the private life of the Pacers' greatest icon. His marriage to Marita Stavru, which many had seen as a perfect match made in the bright lights of stardom, was coming to a crashing halt in a courtroom in Marion County. This wasn't just a simple disagreement over assets, it was a high-stakes investigation into the true net worth of a man who had built a career on deception and clever maneuvers. According to official court documents filed in the Marion County Superior Court, the legal battle over their separation became one of the most talked-about celebrity splits in the region. The investigative reports from the time indicated that Reggie Miller was eventually ordered to pay a staggering lump sum of $5 million as part of the final settlement. But the financial bleeding didn't stop there. Reports from the local press, citing those very same court filings, suggested that the total cost of the divorce, including legal fees and the division of shared properties, reached deep into the eight-figure range. This was a massive blow to the wealth he had spent over a decade accumulating. The documentary evidence from the proceedings painted a picture of a man who was struggling to keep his private affairs from becoming public scandals. In the legal transcripts, there were whispers and allegations about hidden accounts and the true valuation of his various endorsement deals. Fans who once cheered for his audacity on the court were now reading about the cold, hard numbers of his failed domestic life. And yet, as the ink was drying on the divorce papers, a much more sinister story was beginning to emerge from the shadows. It seemed that Reggie Miller wasn't just losing his money, he was losing his composure, leading to a shadowy game of surveillance that would eventually catch the attention of the authorities. In the early 2000s, a bizarre and troubling narrative began to circulate through the offices of private investigators and the desks of sports journalists. It was a story that felt more like a Hollywood thriller than a sports biography. Allegations surfaced that Reggie Miller, unable to let go of the past, had allegedly crossed a dangerous line into the world of professional stalking. According to investigative reports published in major sports tabloids at the time, the basketball superstar was accused of hiring private detectives to follow a man who was reportedly involved with his former wife. This wasn't about protecting his family. It was about control, and it was a move that threatened to destroy his reputation forever. The materials of a civil complaint filed during that era detailed how Reggie Miller supposedly used his vast resources to monitor the movements of private citizens. Legal analysts who reviewed the filings noted that the accusations included claims of intimidation and the unwanted presence of hired surveillance teams. In the public records of the court, there were mentions of restraining orders being discussed, a formal legal mechanism designed to keep one individual away from another. For a man who was used to being the hunter on the basketball court, the role of an alleged stalker was a dark and unexpected twist in his public journey. Journalists covering the story at the time pointed out that this behavior seemed to stem from the same obsessive, competitive drive that made him a legend in the NBA. He couldn't stand the idea of losing, whether it was a game at the buzzer or a person from his life. However, these personal distractions were beginning to have a visible impact on his performance and his standing within the league. While he was busy dealing with the fallout of these shadowy allegations, the leaders of the National Basketball Association were watching him closely. They had noticed a pattern in his play that they felt was undermining the integrity of the game, and they were preparing to pass a law specifically designed to stop him in his tracks. By the season of 2002 to 2003, the officials at the league office had seen enough. Reggie Miller had perfected a technique that many considered the ultimate cheat code in basketball. Every time he went up for a shot, he would kick his long, thin legs outward, making contact with the defender and forcing the referees to blow the whistle in his favor. It was a brilliant, albeit deceptive, way to earn free throws, and it had helped him accumulate a massive portion of his career points. But the authorities decided that this specific form of manipulation had to end. They officially introduced what the media quickly dubbed the Reggie Miller Rule. The official NBA rulebook amendment for that season specifically targeted the act of kicking out during a jump shot. According to the league's disciplinary board, any player caught using this maneuver would now be assessed an offensive foul rather than being rewarded with a trip to the charity stripe. The statistics from the archives of the league show that Reggie Miller had drawn hundreds of fouls using this exact trick over his 19-season career. By codifying this change, the NBA was essentially admitting that one man was so clever and so manipulative that they had to change the laws of the game just to keep him under control. It was the ultimate backhanded compliment to his genius as a provocateur. In the sports columns of the time, this was seen as a direct attack on Reggie's aging game. Without his ability to manufacture points, many wondered if the veteran could still compete at the highest level. The documentary evidence of his decline in free throw attempts following the rule change was clear and measurable. But even as the league tried to legislate his style of play out of existence, Reggie Miller remained a defiant figure. He continued to use his voice and his veteran cunning to stay relevant. However, neither Reggie nor the league could have predicted the absolute chaos that was about to unfold in November of 2004. It was a night of unprecedented violence that would leave the Indiana Pacers' championship dreams in ruins and mark the darkest chapter in the history of professional sports. On the evening of November 19, 2004, the Indiana Pacers were not just a good team, they were the favorites to win the entire championship. Reggie Miller, nearing the conclusion of his professional journey, could finally see the glimmer of that elusive gold ring. He was not on the floor that night due to a physical setback, sitting on the bench in a sharp suit, watching his teammates dominate the defending champion Detroit Pistons. But what started as a typical physical game quickly spiraled into the most significant professional disaster in the history of the league. It was a moment of total chaos that would be remembered as the Malice at the Palace. According to the official investigative files from the National Basketball Association and the police reports from Auburn Hills, the situation exploded when a fan threw a beverage at one of Reggie's teammates. The ensuing brawl didn't stay on the court. It spilled into the stands, involving players and thousands of spectators in a scene of unprecedented violence. The disciplinary records show that the league handed out a total of 143 games in suspensions, a figure that remains a record to this day. While Reggie Miller was a peacemaker that night, trying to pull his teammates back from the brink, the damage was already done. The investigative pieces in the following weeks noted that the heart of the team had been ripped out by these massive suspensions. For Reggie Miller, this was a personal tragedy disguised as a sporting event. He had spent 18 years building toward this moment, only to see it destroyed by a single night of bad decisions. The documents from the team's front office during that period reveal a sense of mourning for a season that was supposed to be a coronation. Instead of a trophy, Reggie was left with a locker room of suspended stars and a city in shock. As the reality set in, the veteran realized that his window of opportunity had slammed shut. But even in the face of this total collapse, the man who had built his career on defiance refused to go out quietly. He prepared for one final season, knowing that the end of his journey was now a mathematical certainty. The date was May 19, 2005. The setting was, ironically, the same arena in Detroit where his championship dreams had vanished just months prior. This was the final game of the Eastern Conference semifinals, and for Reggie Miller, it was the final game of his 19-year career. Throughout his entire professional life, he had stayed loyal to one city and one jersey, a feat of dedication that is almost unheard of in the modern era of sports. According to the official box score from that evening, the veteran went out in spectacular fashion, scoring 27 points and showing the world one last time why he was the most dangerous shooter in the league. As the clock ticked down to the final seconds, something extraordinary happened. The fans in Detroit, who had spent a decade treating Reggie Miller like a villain, stood up and gave him a thunderous ovation. Investigative reporters on the scene noted that even his fiercest rivals, the players who had traded insults and elbows with him for years, stopped to show their respect. The public records of his career statistics confirm that he retired with 2,563 three-pointers, a record that stood for many years as a testament to his precision and longevity. He walked off the floor for the last time with his head held high, though the cameras caught a rare glimpse of emotion in the eyes of the man who usually hid behind a mask of arrogance. In the post-game analysis provided by major sports networks, the narrative was clear. A giant had left the stage. But the conclusion of his playing days was not the conclusion of his influence. The documents from his post-career transition show that he was already being courted by every major television network in the country. They wanted his voice, his sharp mind, and his ability to intrigue an audience. Reggie Miller was about to trade his jersey for a microphone, but he was not ready to stop being the provocateur that the world had grown to love and hate in equal measure. He was entering a new arena where his words would be his only weapon, and he was prepared to use them with lethal accuracy. In August of 2005, the landscape of sports broadcasting changed forever when Reggie Miller signed a high-profile contract with the TNT television network. He didn't just become a commentator, he became a digital judge and jury for the next generation of players. Just as he had done on the court, he brought a level of scrutiny and verbal intensity that made him a polarizing figure in the media. According to investigative reports from the industry, his transition was seamless because he understood the one thing that keeps viewers tuned in: the drama of the truth. He didn't hold back his opinions, often critiquing current superstars with the same cold precision he used to hit game-winning shots. However, the allure of the hardwood was still strong, leading to one of the most intriguing what-if scenarios in basketball history. In the summer of 2007, rumors began to circulate that the Boston Celtics were attempting to lure Reggie Miller out of retirement. They had built a super team, and they wanted the veteran to join them for one final run at a championship. Public records and reports from major sports insiders indicated that the offer was worth approximately $6 million for a single season of work. For a man who had never won a title, this was the ultimate temptation. It was a guaranteed path to the one thing his career was missing. After weeks of public speculation and intense media coverage, Reggie Miller made a decision that shocked the sporting world. He turned the offer down. In his public statements and subsequent interviews, he explained that his loyalty to the Indiana Pacers and the city of Indianapolis was worth more than a ring won in another uniform. This decision cemented his legacy as a man of principle in an era of mercenaries. He chose to remain the voice of the game rather than a secondary player on someone else's stage. He had found a new way to stay relevant, and as we will see, his influence on the game was only just beginning to reach its full potential, even as he faced new challenges in his life away from the cameras. As the modern era of basketball shifted toward a high-speed, long-distance game, many began to wonder if the prototype for this revolution was actually hidden in the archives of the 1990s. While the superstars of today, like Stephen Curry, receive the majority of the praise for the three-point explosion, investigative reports into the history of the sport suggest that it was Reggie Miller who first turned the perimeter shot into a primary weapon of mass destruction. He didn't just play basketball, he conducted a clinical study on how to maximize the value of every single possession. According to the official career statistics archived by the National Basketball Association, he retired with a staggering total of 2,563 three-pointers, a record that stood for many years as a beacon of individual excellence and mechanical precision. But the true measure of his impact isn't found in the total numbers. It is found in what the analysts call clutch moment efficiency. Documentation from NBA advanced stats departments indicates that Reggie Miller was consistently among the top performers in the league when the game was on the line and the clock was ticking down to 0. He possessed a psychological profile that allowed him to remain calm while everyone else was panicking. Various investigative pieces in sports journals have analyzed his shooting form, noting that even under extreme physical pressure and verbal abuse, his mechanics remained identical to his practice sessions. He was the original assassin from the distance, a man who proved that you didn't need to be the strongest person in the arena if you were the most precise and the most mentally resilient. In several retrospective interviews with coaches and general managers from that era, the consensus is clear. Reggie Miller changed the way teams defended the perimeter. He forced the league to move away from the traditional focus on the paint and toward a more dynamic, spacing-oriented strategy. Public records of scouting reports from the early 2000s show that teams began searching for the next Reggie, a player who could combine elite shooting with a legendary level of psychological warfare. However, most experts agree that while many have replicated his shooting, almost no one has been able to replicate his specific brand of fearless leadership. He remains a singular figure in the history of the game, a man who used a simple orange ball to challenge the very foundations of the basketball establishment. The journey of Reggie Miller reached its most significant ceremonial milestone on September 7, 2012, when he was officially welcomed into the Naismith Memorial Basketball Hall of Fame. It was a moment of profound recognition for a man who had spent 19 seasons as the league's most effective antagonist. According to the official records of the induction ceremony, the room was filled with the very legends he had spent his life trying to irritate and defeat. In his speech, he didn't shy away from his reputation. Instead, he embraced it, acknowledging that his ego was the very thing that had allowed him to survive and thrive in an era of giants. This was the formal validation of a career built on defiance and a refusal to back down from the king himself. Today, life for the former Pacers star is a far cry from the heated battles of Madison Square Garden. Financial estimates and reports from publications like Forbes suggest that his clever business moves and long-standing contracts in the media have secured his status as one of the most successful retired athletes in the country. He has traded the locker room for the serene landscapes of California, often seen engaging in high-end cycling and philanthropic efforts that show a much softer side than the one he displayed on the hardwood. Yet, in the public documents regarding his current assets and ventures, one thing is clear. He has managed his post-playing days with the same calculated precision that he once used to bait Michael Jordan into a technical foul. He has maintained his relevance in a way that few of his peers have managed to achieve. As we conclude this investigation into the life of the Knick killer, one question remains for every fan and critic. Was Reggie Miller a villain, or was he just the only person honest enough to tell the world that the king wasn't untouchable? He never received a championship ring, but he earned something that many consider even more valuable, the eternal respect of his enemies. He proved that even without the physical gifts of a god, a man with enough audacity and a perfect jump shot could change the world of sports forever. He left the game on his own terms, with his head held high and his legacy intact, leaving us all to wonder when we will ever see another player with the courage to smile in the face of absolute greatness and take the final shot.